So welcome everybody to the Copper Queen Library. Very excited to have Joe Cook here, and actually Marianne Capehart from Waterwise is also joining us. And this presentation on subsidence in Cochise County, uh, I assume like the rest of you, you have noticed pictures of sinkholes appearing um, in the news and in social media over the last months. And I just really wanted to learn more. And I felt like our community really wanted to learn more as well. And so Marianne connected me with Joe Cook, and that's how we got here. And I think that um, questions are always great. People go to the library to ask questions, but even better is when you don't know the answer to a question, go to somebody who does. So I'm going to introduce Marianne Capehart from Waterwise to introduce Joe.
Hi,
Welcome.
everybody. Thanks so much for coming. And thank you, Allison, for being responsive to people's needs and interests. And yeah, it's a pretty timely topic. There's been a lot of media coverage of groundwater and also the fissures. So we all want to find out how they work. And so we're delighted to have Joe Cook here from the Arizona Geological Survey, who has been educated at the University of Arizona. He is a research scientist, and his interests, he does a variety of things: debris flow, Bahada axial river relationships, desert pavements, Aeolian geomorphology, and Playa Piedmont interaction. If we could only learn about all of that. But tonight we're going to do fissures and subsidence. And he's been working in this area for, he was telling me, about 10 years. So he's seen the progression, or whatever he'll tell us the phenomena that's been happening regarding these two phenomena. With no further ado, I will introduce to you Joe Cook. Thank you so much for being here, Joe.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm gonna figure out how to share my screen real quick because I changed my window sizes and everything's different now. All right, so does that look all right to you guys? Can you see the whole screen?
Mm-hmm. Looks good.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, so I'm Joe. I work for the Arizona Geological Survey, and I'm just going to give you an overview tonight of what is land subsidence and what are earth fissures and where do they occur, and how scared of these things should you be. So we can take time to answer questions at the end, but I'm just going to kind of give an overview, and we'll start with what are earth fissures, where and why do they form, why do we care at all, what's the history of them in Arizona, what are the current conditions, and what do we expect to happen going forward. And then I have just a lot of show and tell kind of photos from throughout Arizona. And then we actually had quite a bit of activity in Cochise County this summer with the excellent monsoon. So I'll give some examples from there as well. So to kind of just start with what is a fissure, it's basically just a crack. We can use earth cracks. There's lots of different names, but it's an earth crack that forms due to tension. So two things like pulling apart is what causes these cracks to form. But they're really large cracks. They can be miles long. They can be hundreds of feet deep, but you don't generally see them that deep open at the surface. Sometimes they're 20, 30 feet deep. It's still pretty intimidating. You wouldn't want to stand on the edge of it, but like it has to go down to a great depth to accommodate for how much missing dirt there is. But basically these fissures form due to land subsidence. And I want you to think of land subsidence as basically the land surface sinking. I'm not sure you can see the mouse. I can change to a laser pointer. I don't know if this is better, but basically this diagram here shows this was the initial land surface. And then later on, we had land subsidence, which in Arizona is due to all the groundwater that we pump out of the ground. Basically, as you pump water out of the subsurface, all the sediment grains can pack in tighter and you get compaction, which results in subsidence at the surface. So over time, we can have the land basically sinks a whole valley. You have to think of it in terms of a widespread phenomenon. It's not just like your backyard. It'd be the whole area in between the mountain ranges. So for like Wilcox Basin, think of where Wilcox Playa is. Well, there's a big subsidence area off to the west, and there's another one off to the north, but it's really, really big areas. And where we get earth fissures is where the change in that subsidence is the most dramatic. So in this example, we have sediment that's on top of shallow bedrock that really can't sink very far because you have immobile bedrock underneath it. But out in the valley or out in the center of the basin where the bedrock is much deeper, that land surface can sink a lot more. And so where you get this change from a little subsidence to a lot of subsidence, you can get these fissures forming. So they're a tension crack that forms in these zones. We call it differential compaction or differential subsidence, but it's where one side isn't sinking that much and the other side is sinking a lot. So those are the zones that we tend to find these things. And I'll give you some better examples that aren't just block diagrams, but we tend to see them forming over the top of any change in the subsurface. So it could be where the bedrock drops off and gets much deeper, or it could be just a buried, shallow Inselberg or some kind of buried bedrock topography. As that sediment in the basin is draped over this immobile bedrock, you can get differential compaction or subsidence, which can result in fissures. So all of this stuff that we see in Arizona is basically due to us using too much groundwater. There's areas where the groundwater has been withdrawn hundreds of feet. I thought that was the next slide, but it's not. So let me do this one first. So these are those block diagrams where it shows basically you start out with this narrow tension crack. As water infiltrates into that crack, you can get subsurface erosion. And then when we tend to notice the fissures is when these near surface pieces fall into that underground void. And so to give you some real world examples, this is a fissure up in Apache Junction, and you can see there's some warehouse properties in the background. But this fissure has been here since like the 60s or 70s, and it's still active. There's still water that pours into this, and it swallows a bunch of sediment and water every monsoon. And it's basically a problem for all these businesses that own property that are on top of this fissure in the distance. I have a better photo of that in a minute. But this type of fissure kind of looks like this block diagram here. And it's not just tumbleweeds and stuff in there. There's like shopping carts and trash and all kinds of stuff you don't really want. Groundwater, some of this, one of the hazards of fissures is as it rains and all this water is captured in these fissures, pollutants and chemicals that you don't necessarily want getting deep underground, potentially to the groundwater level, can get in there through fissures, because some of them can propagate hundreds of feet deep. One of the other hazards here is like, this is kind of what I was saying, this example, where you only have a narrow crack at the surface, and you can still see this narrow tension crack going down. But here we have a big collapse, and it's open to a wider level underneath. So all this dirt on the subsurface fell in, it slumped into that fissure, and it's gone. It basically goes down this crack that, it has to go really deep to accommodate all this volume of sediment. But you don't always see it super deep at the surface. But the fact remains that large chunks of dirt will just fall in abruptly, usually during a heavy rain event. Like the monsoon tends to be a season where we see lots of new fissures opening or existing fissures getting ripped open further, basically just through erosion. This is that same fissure that was on the left in the previous slide, but now we're at one of these businesses, and you can see they've got this line of pallets kind of marking off this area that they don't want people going in. And you can't see in this photo, but there's hairline cracks in the asphalt that continue out to about where those pallets are. But when I got on the scene here, I told the guy, I'm like, this fissure doesn't just stop there. It actually keeps going off into the distance. It curves under this yard where all these vehicles are. So we have air photos of this area before they built all these businesses, and you could see the fissures there. But then, before we had any kind of rules about where you can build and what you have to disclose to landowners, basically they paved over a lot of these fissures, and they've been a persistent problem for these business owners ever since. So you can see that this void continues into the subsurface, and they've had repeated problems in this area from the same fissure. This was taken in July of 2017, and the road that this broke opened up again in 2018, right after the county paid a lot of money to fix the road. So they can be repeatedly destructive and a big nuisance if you happen to own property right on top of the fissure. Okay, I mentioned before about areas with groundwater withdrawal. So this is an old figure. This is from 1986, but it's still really relevant. And the locations of these areas where we have withdrawn groundwater coincide pretty well with where we have fissures. You can't, I don't expect you guys to be able to read this, but basically the darker colors are where the groundwater has been taken down, in some cases greater than 500 feet. And then the red areas where in the 80s we had earth fissures. So this area is around Picacho Peak. This is near the Santan Mountains. And then you have some Bowie, San Simon, and Wilcox Basin features over here. There's not a whole lot of groundwater lowering in Cochise County at this point in time, but since the 80s, the pumping has continued, and now we have some really dramatic land subsidence down there. But I just wanted to show you this example because this was known way back in the 80s that groundwater withdrawal is tied to land subsidence, which is what causes the fissures to form. So it's really relevant to what we're seeing today. So this distribution of groundwater lowering results in subsidence, which can result in fissures. So here's some ground photos of actual measured subsidence. So this is just a wellhead. This is down in Cochise County. There's a bunch of these, but I like this picture. So this concrete pad used to be on the ground where these big nails are, but because the whole valley of sediment is being lowered due to groundwater withdrawal, this concrete pad is stuck to this well casing that goes hundreds of feet in the ground. So it doesn't sink with everything else, but you can just see locally that there's at least a few feet of subsidence since this concrete was poured. This is a pretty iconic photo. This is Herb Schumann. He's the guy that did that groundwater lowering figure from the 80s. But he's standing near Eloy, Arizona. And there has been, at this point in time, this was in 1985, they've had 15.5 feet of subsidence. So what that means is the ground surface used to be up here where this 1952 is on the sign. But in 1985, you're down here at the ground. So this is a really extreme example of a lot of land subsidence. So this was a long-term agricultural area in Pinal County. And because they pumped so much water out, there were parts of the valley that sank more than 15 feet. Now we have examples of this same phenomenon happening in the Wilcox Basin. This is Brian Conway. He's the guy I work with a lot with the Department of Water Resources. So he recreated this Herb Schumann style photo with some data that he found in Cochise County. So this is about 9.7 feet of subsidence from 1969 to 2018. And it's continued on today. So now we're over 10 feet in Cochise County at this location, and we're over, well, nearly 20 feet where Herb was standing near Eloy. So, I mean, these are extreme examples. Not every place has this much subsidence, but it's really clear that it's a big regional problem that we've been documenting for decades. So this is a figure. The red areas are where Department of Water Resources monitors land subsidence. So they have satellite data that does a really good job of showing them where the ground surface is changing. And in Arizona, most of it's sinking because of groundwater use. So these red areas delineate where there is subsidence. And then the blue boxes are areas where AZGS is mapped fissures. So you basically see really good overlap between the two because you need subsidence to form the fissures. And some areas have subsidence, like Tucson has a little bit, but we don't have fissures there. There just hasn't been enough subsidence yet. And there's big areas in the Wilcox Basin where we have subsidence, but we don't have any fissures yet. But based on the amount of subsidence that we're seeing, it seems kind of inevitable that we will see more and more and require more study areas to be delineated. Okay, so just a summary. I'm not going to go through all these, but basically AZGS has been making maps that are official state of Arizona maps of fissures since about 2007. And the reason we make those maps is because if you buy or sell property in Arizona, there is a line that if you've sold or bought a house recently, you may have noticed, it asks you, are there fissures on your property? And you're required to disclose them to a buyer. Even if it's not a home or anything, if it's just land, you still have to disclose it. And this was pushed forward by the realtors in Arizona because they had a number of examples where somebody bought a property, found out there's a fissure on it, damaged their property, they couldn't sell it for the same amount, and they wanted to be told before they bought it. So you would want to be informed if you were buying a property that had fissures on it. And so that's what these maps are for, but they're also interesting just to kind of document change over time. So far we're up to 27 study areas. with a total of about 170 miles of fissures and another 180 miles of fissures that came from older maps that we can't be sure are really there. And these are areas that are under plowed fields or under parking lots or neighborhoods now. So, you know, a lot of these things were mapped in the 70s. And by the time we got around to doing our maps, a lot of urban sprawl had occurred. So unfortunately, we couldn't check all these ones that had been mapped in the past. So we know this is the minimum amount of fissures in Arizona. It's probably a lot higher. But basically what we do at this point is we keep an eye out on active areas that we have a lot of subsidence. Cochise County is one that we did a lot of this year. And we partner with ADWR to kind of see where the most subsidence, where that most differential subsidence is occurring. And we keep eyes on those areas to see when new fissures would form. And then as we go forward, we update and re-release the maps. So some of these maps are on like their 5th version because we keep getting new stuff to map. Like out in the Chandler Heights area, I think it's like version 5 or 6 because there's just more fissures almost every year. This is a figure from a paper in the 80s, and basically all you need to know here is these hashed outlines are the Casa Grande Mountains. These little dashed areas are crops or plowed areas, and then the small narrow black lines are fissures. So 1949, there were no fissures here, but there had been pumping already for decades. They've been taking groundwater out of the ground in Pinal County near Eloy for a long time. By 1954, we see our first fissure in this area. 1958, that fissure has grown and more fissures are forming outside in other areas near bedrock. And you can see as this network just kind of keeps expanding, 58, 64, 70, 1980. By 1980, you've got a pretty clear network of fissures with a lot of parallel cracks, and a lot of subsidence has occurred in this area. And some of these cracks are just covered up by fields. You know, every year they plow the field, or maybe a couple times a year, and you don't see that fissure anymore, but it's still there. You know, it goes much deeper than the plowing does. So these aren't really a problem when they're out in the farmland, but if you then build homes over former farmland, and I'll give you some examples of that, that's when they become more of a problem for more people. So this is that same area as the previous figure, and all these little vegetated cracks are fissures, okay? And then these darker areas are actual low spots where when it rains, water ponds up. And it didn't used to do that. You know, water usually drains away from the mountains and goes towards the lower areas. But because we've had so much subsidence here, water actually just forms these pools and doesn't go anywhere. So you have these low spots surrounded by a bunch of cracks. And I don't know how clear that is on the screen, but basically the line work that we have on this map is right on top of those vegetated lineaments. They're easy to see in photos. And then when you go out in the field and map them, it's easy to follow them for the most part. But here's an example of this fissure cruising on down to the south, and then it just stops at the edge of the field. Well, it doesn't really stop. It's just we can't see anything at the surface anymore to map it. So we don't show that what we can't see on the map unless it was mapped previously by a geologist. But one thing I want to mention that I didn't make clear before is a lot of these fissures form and they contour right around bedrock outcrops. So you see how nicely these mirror, like almost like a contour line. There's some more over here on this side of the mountains. So that's where that change in subsidence is the greatest. The ground surface is not sinking very close to the mountain front, but it's sinking a lot more where the bedrock is deeper. So you get fissures where that change occurs. All right, so here's 3 examples where you know, we have mapped fissures that go under fields, and this stuff we mapped before this field was here, so it's all red. And we have different line types that are on our maps. But then you get up into this yellow area, and this field was always here since 2007 when we did the mapping. But if you flip back through some of the air photos, you can see points in time when these fissures were visible. So we went ahead and added that to the map. But I just want to give you all these different settings of where fissures are. And I've never asked a farmer or somebody that maintains these center pivots, but I don't know how much of a problem these are for them. I could imagine that it's sort of problematic if there's a big deep crack where the wheels of the center pivot try to go across, but it'd be interesting to know. So towards the end, if anyone has any stories, I'd like to hear it. So that's an example from Dragoon Road down in Cochise County, just southwest of the playa. Here's an example from Apache Junction. These are those fissures I showed earlier, and they go under these businesses here, and then they swing around. So these fissures were all here before we built all this these factories or kind of more machine shop kind of industrial property, but it's a problem for some of these people when they open up and disrupt their business. It costs a lot of money to fill it in with dirt, which isn't even a fix really. It just kind of fills it in with dirt. And then we have an example from Chandler Heights where we have a lot of private homes right next to and sometimes on top of these fissures. But these next slides show that fissure, which we call the Y crack. It kind of has this Y shape. But this is what it looked like in 1976. So we have lots of citrus fields over here. This is just north of the Santan Mountains near the town of Gilbert, or you could call it Chandler Heights. But you can see the cracks in the air photo here, but I put on this annotation to show you where it is in case it's not obvious. But what I want to point out is there's really no homes here except for like a couple little properties. Okay, and then when you move forward in time from 1976 to 79, we still have the fissure present and there's another home built. Now we go forward to 2000. There's a few more homes down here. By the time we get to 2018, this is pretty much what it looks like today. There's a lot of homes built along the northern extension of this fissure, and there's a lot of homes built along this crack too. And so all these homes were built right next to and on top of this fissure that we knew about. And it's been a real problem for people, particularly on this northern extension. I'll show you some ground photos next. This is that crack. This picture was taken in the 1990s, I believe, but it has been there since the 1960s, and it's remained open to pretty great depths for decades. You can see here these yellow lines kind of show areas where this crack propagates from the surface to greater depths. And you probably wouldn't, you can imagine you wouldn't want to stand right here. This is one of the hazards of fissures. Like if you're looking at this, it doesn't look too threatening, but you don't know you're standing over this deep void. So that's pretty dangerous if you have kids in the area or pets or want to build a house anywhere near this. So here's some photos of the Y crack. Most of these have date stamps on them, but you'll notice that they're all basically during the monsoon time of year. That's when we get the intense rains, which erode these open rapidly. So that's the pattern we see repeatedly, is you have a fissure and then you have heavy rains, which erode the fissure open very rapidly. So that tends to be when the road is damaged, when somebody notices a fissure. It may have been there for years, but it doesn't erode open in a dramatic way until there's enough water. So this, you can tell, goes under somebody's fence line right next to their home. This is going right towards this person's house, and there's a lot of parallel cracks that propagate up towards the driveway in this car. This person actually, I don't know if they were trying to drive into their home or it just opened up under their car, but the front tire's flat. So, I mean, imagine if you were coming home at dark and you know your driveway, but you didn't expect a big crack to be there, you might just drive right into it. And I've heard stories in Cochise County of, Border Patrol agents or people that drive these kind of more rural roads later at night of driving into or on top of these things and damaging their vehicles. And I'm not aware of a story where anyone was seriously injured, but you could see how it could be possible. So this is going under horse property. This is still that Y crack, the northern extension, still in the monsoon season. But you can notice, I don't know if you could tell in the photo, but there's a lot of ripple marks on the ground here. So water was just flowing all over this surface, and then it ripped open this fissure, and all the water went into the fissure and collapsed all the ground around it. This, I don't know if it was 2007 or 2009, but one of these events resulted in a horse falling into the fissure, and it couldn't be extracted, so they had to put the horse down. So that's the only casualty I'm aware of, was a horse, but it did abruptly open, catch the horse unaware, and result in that horse dying. And even if you didn't have serious damage to your property, it's a really difficult thing to fill this in, and it's kind of a temporary fix because the fissures, as I said, go really deep, and all the fill that you put in there could just be swallowed during the next monsoon storm. Okay, so I've mentioned some of these already, but the general hazards of fissures is they just are destructive and dangerous. They go under basically everything. So it doesn't matter if there's a road on the surface, your power lines, wells, anything, canals. Basically, they can undermine any of those features, and they can abruptly open. We don't always know that there's fissures there until they open, and they can sometimes open thousands of feet at a time. Other kind of features or hazards that happen later on is they can disrupt surface drainages. So you can imagine if there's a wash that flows naturally, but a fissure opens across that wash. Well, now all that water from the wash is going to flow into the fissure and come out somewhere else. And that's what we're seeing examples of in Cochise County. There's a lot of examples where water is captured and taken in areas that it didn't used to go. And it also erodes areas that didn't used to be at threat of erosion. Hazardous to livestock. If you throw or if nasty water gets in these fissures, there's the potential that it can get to great depths and contaminate groundwater. You can not have access to your property if there's a big crack across your one access point. And when you go to sell it, like I said, you have to tell the next buyer that it's there. And that can result in lowered property values. You can ask anyone at the county level, but fixing a fissure is often pretty difficult and not cheap. So if you're just a landowner and a fissure opens, like you have to fix that stuff yourself, and it can be really difficult and expensive. And then you don't always know there's a fissure underground that's really open. Sometimes all you see is a narrow crack that doesn't look very threatening, but there's a big void underneath. Here's some examples of that. Like from this angle, you could see a large void underground, but if you were just walking along in this area, it just looks like kind of a tiny wash. But this is less than a foot thick, and if you step on that, you could fall through, land in there. And there's just some more examples of hairline cracks that go off in the distance, but big voids underground. This is an unfortunate reality in Arizona and other places. There's basically all kinds of dumping in the desert. Any kind of hole in the ground or earth fissure, people like to fill it with garbage because they don't dispose of things properly. And if rainwater leaches through this roofing material and chemicals or these whatever was in these 55-gallon drums, all that stuff can potentially get into the groundwater, like a conduit to the groundwater level. So that's bad news. This was back in 2011. We were actually mapping fissures near Alfreda, and I heard a noise, and there was a calf stuck in the muddy bottom of this small fissure. So we were able to get that calf out and get him back to the owner. But there's been other examples where you just find a skeleton or a dead animal, because they tend to capture water, and if an animal that's heavy enough gets in there, they just sink into the mud and they can't get out. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the past and what fissures are. So here is kind of where we're at today. What are we seeing happen today? Okay, we've mapped everything. What's changing? So we see that subsidence in most areas has waned. So where we used to have a lot of subsidence, near Eloy, we've gone almost 20 feet. Today, they're not really sinking that fast. Yet we still see new fissures forming. And so in this example here, you could see these kind of cat scratch lineaments. They're annotated. So the darker lines are fissures that were there in the past. And then the yellow lines are fissures that are brand new as of a few years ago. Okay, so when we see new fissures forming in areas with fissures already, they tend to extend from existing fissures, or they bridge gaps in between fissures, or they form parallel to them. And that's because they're all forming based on the subsidence pattern that is local to that area. But we're still seeing things open 20, 30 years after the pumping has really slowed down. Like this area stopped pumping groundwater once they started getting water from the CAP canal. So either these fissures were already present and never eroded open until 2018, 2019, or they're still forming at a slower rate. There's a lag time between when all the subsidence happen and when we tend to see these fissures. But generally they do form and open in the monsoon season. That just seems to be universal truth everywhere. Here's some ground photos of fresh fissures. I didn't really get into it earlier, but you can always tell a fresh earth fissure when the sides are nice and steep and vertical, and there's not stuff growing in the bottom. Because after the first year, basically if this fissure captures water, there's going to be weeds and plants and trees growing in the bottom of the fissure, or at least along the sides. So whenever you see a fresh, steep-sided crack in the ground without anything growing in it, you can tell it's probably from that year or maybe a year or two older than that. But this is one that opened up near out west of Picacho Peak that we found in Google Earth actually, and then went out in the ground and it was even bigger. Yeah, this is that same crack, it's really deep in some areas up to 30, 35 feet. And then other areas it's just a narrow crack, and then you have collapse just randomly in certain areas where the void was big enough. But this fissure was big enough and deep enough that one of our guys, this is Brian Guti, who works for AZGS, flew the drone inside it and took some really cool video. I didn't put it in this presentation, but if you go to YouTube and Google AZGS Earth Fissure, you can see the drone video from this. It's really cool. I have some still photos here coming up, but you notice me in this photo, I'm just kind of carefully looking over the edge. And that's because you have this parallel crack right along the edge of this thing. And all this dirt is just ready to kind of topple into that void. There's nothing supporting it. So it's just like, you don't really, if you ever go out looking at these, don't stand right on the edge. It sounds obvious, but I just have to say it. So these are some shots from the drone photo. This is kind of an oblique image. And this crack actually extends across these washes, like I mentioned earlier, all the way into the distance. So I have some annotation that shows these are those really tall power lines in the background. So this goes a long ways. The whole thing is almost a mile long. And we didn't see any sign of this before it opened a few years ago. This is just a straight down shot that shows us standing next to the fissure. And you can see there's wider areas. There's areas where water has poured in and eroded some of the sediment into the fissure. And there's other areas where it's still really dark and narrow. This is another large fissure we call Rogers Fissure just because of the property it crosses. It's up in the Harquahala Valley. And it opened back in '97, but it's still open in a big way today. And it's been so persistently open and deep that all the times I've been out there, there's one particular area where a family of owls live. And it must be because it's nice and shady in there in the daytime. But every time I'm there, I kind of bug them and they fly out. But they're persistently deep crack. And there's not much out here, thankfully, but they can be pretty dangerous. I just want to show this photo. This is March 2013. And if you look at this little fissure that just looks like a bunch of bushes in a line, and we go forward into December 2014, you can see that this fissure extended in both directions a few hundred feet with no hint of it on the surface. To my eye, there's not really anything going on. And then all of a sudden you have, a fissure that opened up and extended. So you can imagine, let's say you wanted to buy property and build your home out here. And you're like, well, I'm far away from this fissure, I'm fine. Well, the next year it rips open. So, I mean, you don't even have to necessarily be right next to one. You could be one that's going to open later. So there's these fissure zones that we have to watch out for. So being that this is a Cochise County focus talk, getting there, but I want to mention these things called giant desiccation cracks. And I'm not sure if anyone's heard of these before, but if you've seen mud cracks, small little polygonal cracks, like when a mud puddle dries up, these are basically the same thing. They're just really, really big. So here's Mike Mahan. He worked with us mapping fissures a while ago, and he's walking next to what I call a triple junction. So you have a crack going in this direction and then two more cracks. So you're basically looking at this junction of three different cracks. And if you were to draw a line like your bird's eye view, some of these polygons are hundreds of feet across. So they're just like really, really big mud cracks. And they form from wetting and drying of certain soils. So in Wilcox, they tend to be soils with lots of clay or salt. So those soils tend to form in areas around the playa or real low relief areas that don't drain very well. Closed basin sediments tend to be real fine grained. But when you're looking at them on the ground, they can look a lot like an earth fissure, and they can be destructive like an earth fissure, but they form from different processes. So these form just from desiccation of the near surface sediment. They're typically 12 feet deep or less, but unfortunately in Cochise County, we have both kinds, and sometimes they're in the same area. So it's really hard to tell them apart. We're trying to make a map, and it's hard to tell, is this a GDC or is this a fissure? But if it's on your road, it almost doesn't matter because it's still a problem and a nuisance for you. So I'll give you an example. This is just north of Apple Annie's, north of the playa. And there's a whole bunch of cracks out here, and some of them form kind of these triple junctions, like I mentioned before. And some of them form these cracks that go persistently throughout the area, and they match up better with the subsidence pattern that's measured. So how do you tease these apart? Like at first glance, the yellow ones are more likely fissures because they form along the subsidence pattern that we see. And then anything with a polygonal kind of junction pattern is a desiccation crack. But it's really hard to say. And some of the desiccation cracks are much deeper near fissures because the fissure opens them up to greater depths, and then they can erode to greater depths. So on our maps, we tend to lump these areas and call them hybrid features. But I just want to illustrate that there's more than one type of crack in Cochise County, and it can be hard to tell apart. So here's a figure I made that just shows the extent of lake sediments around Wilcox Playa. So today, Wilcox Playa is a dry lake bed, and it occupies this white area in the middle. But in the past, like in the latest Pleistocene, when we had mammoths and things like that, it was a bigger footprint. We had water out to this extent. And at another point in the past, we had water all the way up to here, these different elevations, 1,274 meters, 1,290 meters. There's been a lot of study on shorelines. I'm not sure how much folks out there know the landmarks, but this right here is the Three Sisters Buttes, south of the playa. This is the Sulphur Hills. We have the power plant here by Dragoon Road. But I just want to show that the extent of these old shorelines coincides really well with where we have these fields of polygonal cracks, these giant desiccation cracks. So these old marginal lake sediments are kind of the Goldilocks zone where these things like to form. But unfortunately, we've pumped so much water out, now we have subsidence cracks in the same areas. So it can be tough to tell them apart. But that's why we have so many in Cochise County, at least around the Wilcox area. So this was from this summer. This was in July. Some of you guys were probably impacted by Highway 191 being closed. So we got a call from ADOT. By the time we got out there, they'd already dug a bunch of holes through the road. But you can see here, you kind of have this crack in the road, and one side's higher than the other. The X is on the lower side. And we don't know if there's fissures here or not, but we do know that there's polygonal cracks. These are some of the lines that I saw in air photos, and then all the yellow dots are areas where we saw cracks on the ground, and they all tended to kind of form these big polygons. So I tentatively told them it's most likely desiccation cracks and not fissures. But I don't know if it's obvious in this photo, but there's kind of this darker green area that's next to the highway. So this is where a natural drainage gets impounded next to the highway. So that's all green because water persistently gets delivered to this area and soaks in. Well, if you have desiccation cracks, that's real bad because you're wetting them and then they're drying out, and then you're wetting them again every time it rains. So that could be a problem area for this damage to the road. It could just be because the water is impounded next to the highway. But all this is just based on surface observations, so we don't know for sure. But this is just to illustrate that desiccation cracks can be destructive as well. Earlier I said that they tend to be 12 feet deep or less. In this image, this man with ADOT is inserting a pole about 10 to 12 feet down into this hole that they just dug with a tractor. So this was under the road, and there was an open void under the asphalt that was starting to slump in. And this image here is a whole bunch of cement that they pumped into one of these open cracks. And I recall, I don't remember exactly how many truckloads of grout or cement they put in, but it was a lot. And this was kind of their attempt to fix what underlies the road here, fix the voids that underlie the road, so that when they fix the asphalt at the surface, it doesn't just crack and fall in again. So they grouted in quite a bit in this area and repaved the road. But this had to cost some money, right? This is all because of these cracks. These are naturally occurring if they're GDCs, but the fissures are kind of a man-made problem. Just more examples of grouted holes underneath the highway. And basically these are all the yellow dots I took in that previous slide. And there's fissures off to both, or I'm sorry, cracks off to both sides of the road here, most likely GDCs. Okay, we're going to show some INSAR here. And INSAR is what Department of Water Resources uses to measure subsidence. So just as a preview, these are fissures that we have mapped. These are basically trending north-south. This is that power plant that is along 191. This is Dragoon Road, just north of all these pecan orchards. And there's some center pivots. This is an old photo because there's more center pivots, and this whole area has been plowed for more agriculture. But this same area has all this tie-dye looking colors. So what this overlay is supposed to show you is this is called an interferogram. And this is what Department of Water Resources uses to tell where the ground is sinking, where's the limits of the land subsidence. And basically what you should see is all these concentric rings of color kind of centered on this agriculture near Dragoon Road. So for each revolution of this color ramp down here is 2.8 centimeters of subsidence, so just a bit more than an inch. And that subsidence was measured over a certain time frame. They basically take one pass with a satellite, and then they take a pass later on and they find the difference. So from May 2008 to May 2010, they measured at least 6 to 7 inches of subsidence just in this one area, just in those 2 years. And it's centered right on where all the pumping is for agriculture. And this particular fissure, I'm sure most of you have driven this Dragoon Road. There's all kinds of signage saying, you know, caution earth fissures. And there's a big bump in the road because this side of the road is higher than this side because we have so much subsidence. And now we're starting to see cracks form along the east side of this subsidence bowl as well. So I have some photos from new fissures that opened up on the east side coming up. But keep in mind, this is just 2 years, so this has been sinking a lot more and it's continuing to sink. So I have some images later where more zoomed out and you can see more regionally where the sinking is happening. Okay, so these are our study areas for Cochise County. So we have North Sulphur Springs Valley. You notice it's mostly where all these center pivots are. Wilcox Playa, we have a little bit of subsidence near Croton Spring. This is the Dragoon Road study area. This is the Three Sisters Buttes, Sulphur Hills study area. And then we have a really large one over here by Bowie, San Simon. But I'm gonna show another INSAR interferogram here, and it's pretty astounding. Okay, so this is another, it's only 2 years, but if you look in these areas, North Sulphur Springs Valley, how many tight bands of subsidence there are. So these are those areas where we're most likely to see fissures forming because that's where the ground is sinking. It's changing the most. You know, one side is not sinking and the other side is sinking a whole lot. So those are areas we typically expect to see new fissures forming. Down here in Dragoon Road, it's just like a bullseye right on those pecan orchards. You know, there's other subsidence that's also other bullseyes, but I don't have any fissures there yet. But I wouldn't be surprised to find some there soon or someday. And you know, depending on when you look at the interferograms for this, the pattern can be a little different. But generally, these blue areas that we delineate to look for fissures, they match the limits of these interferograms really well because that's where the subsidence is occurring and that's what causes the fissures. So Cochise County has a lot going on, and it's continuing to go down because there's no regulation on how much pumping can occur. And there's a lot of expansion and new wells being drilled. Almost every time I'm out there, I see well trucks driving around to drill in new wells and new sections of desert being bladed for new fields or orchards. So I'm not sure if there's an end in sight, but it's definitely a lot of activity going on. Okay, so some field photos from this year. This is a month after I was out there for Highway 191. We had a fissure that reopened across Dragoon Road. It wasn't the big one that's right at the intersection, but this is the one that's on the east side of that subsidence bowl. So now we have cracks on both sides, and you can see the power plant in the distance. But this thing it's been open before, but it ripped open again. And you can see where it goes under the road here. There's my 1 liter water bottle for scale. The road was closed, but people were driving over this anyways. And I don't know. I wouldn't want to drive over that one, knowing the void that's open underneath. The last time I was out here mapping this was still natural desert, but by this year it has been bladed, but this fissure reopened underneath the change or bladed soil. This is just another view from another angle showing that at the road, you only see this little crack. And if you didn't know that there was obvious erosion and collapse off to the side, you might think that's just a typical asphalt crack, but it's got a big deep void underneath. So I assume this has been fixed, but I don't know how they fixed it. Usually they just fill it in and repave that little section, but it's kind of a dirt band-aid, I call them, because it'll open again if it's enough rain. So this area is a little screenshot of our Three Sisters Butte study area. So we're looking at the foothills of the Sulphur Hills here. And this area, see all these polygonal cracks? Some of these are probably desiccation cracks. We're right on the edge of that old shoreline, but there's been fissures that formed throughout that network. So now they've been deepened and it's hard to tell what's what. So this is where I kind of punted and developed this new thing called hybrid desiccation crack fissures. So I know they're probably not all fissures, but they've been enhanced by fissures. But I want to spend most of our time looking at Parker Ranch Road here. So there's 4 fissures that cross the road. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And most of these opened up 10 years ago, all of a sudden across the road. And then the ones with yellow arrows reopened this year. And Parker Ranch Road was closed as well because they really damaged the road. And I didn't see anyone driving across this, thank goodness. But this is one of those fissures that opened, and you can see the asphalt sagging in. It's just out of frame, but water was still pouring into this fissure from the ditch on the side of the road when I was there. And big chunks of asphalt were just falling into the void. And this fissure was full of water. Looking in the other direction, there's my water bottle again. So you could see, you know, big chunks of this bank would fall off into the water. And this fence line is just completely stretched out over the top. These are just touching water, not ground. But this fissure obviously intercepted a lot of water during one of these monsoon storms, and it resulted in the road being undermined. Going down to the next fissure that opened, this one was even bigger, but the road still looks a little more intact. But you can see how you wouldn't want to drive across. I drank all the water from the other water bottles, so now we're up to a bigger one. But looking in the other direction, it's hard to tell, but there's a 2-track dirt road over here, and this was one guy's access to his property, but he's been plagued by this fissure for 10 years now, and this thing opens up every time there's a good monsoon storm, and he has to bring heavy equipment out to kind of fill it in. And this year is worse than any other year in memory. So I'm not sure if he's been able to get into his property or not. But you can see there's standing water in this crack. You can see there's a lot of evidence for flow into standing water. And then we had some new fissures form. You can tell it's new again because it's got steep sides, nothing growing in it. It's kind of just cutting across whatever's at the surface. So this is now a map that I have to update because we had reactivation of the old fissures and formation of new ones. And these fissures, they just tend to go off into the distance and then they taper closed. You can see here we're at a point where you don't have a continuous open crack. You've got a crack here and then a pothole and then a pothole and then a pothole. But it goes off into that grassy area and tapers closed. But you know, we don't really know to what depth it's open in the subsurface. This is just a view underneath Parker Ranch Road at that large opening. You can see completely underneath it, it was going under there. So this is kind of a sloppy way to wrap this up, but I just want to mention that the water use in Arizona is a problem because we use more than we replenish naturally. And at least in parts of central Arizona, we had a solution for a while where we used water from Lake Mead and the CAP canal. But the last time I gave this talk, we weren't actually at this level. Like the 1075 was a level of the reservoir where we had to declare a shortage, like it is officially a shortage. Now we're at 1067, so that shortage has been declared. And Arizona, some farmers in Pinal and Maricopa counties are not going to get water like they did in these canals. So they're going to switch back to groundwater pumping. So what are we going to see if we start pumping groundwater again? Well, you know, are we going to see renewed subsidence and fissures? I think so. I don't know. I don't have like a time for you, but you know, it just seems like if we do the same thing we already did in the past, we should see more of the same. The other issue is Cochise County never got any CAP water, but there's also zero regulation on what can be pumped. So that's why in Cochise County, we have some of the most dramatic subsidence in Arizona. So those interferograms that show those tight color fringes, those are like every year. So there's areas that are sinking multiple inches a year, right where the most pumping is happening. So I don't know what the solution for Cochise County is, but I guess this is just kind of a warning. I mean, we're going to keep seeing these things form, and you already have the GDCs naturally. So if there's a really good monsoon season, just be careful if you're driving through some of these areas that are known to have these cracks. So yeah, down in the Wilcox area, all of this red zone is potentially an area that fissures can form. Bowie San Simon is also a large area, but are we going to see more fissures kind of renewed formation in Pinal and Maricopa counties? I don't know. I guess it depends how long and how much water we start pumping. So that's my overview. I hope I covered stuff, but I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has questions.
Thank you, Joe. Wow, that was very comprehensive and interesting and a little scary. I will open it up to questions in just a minute, and also feel free if you would like to type your question in the chat box, I can read them out, or you can unmute yourself. So I guess my first question is the obvious. Why do we have no regulation in Cochise County? And
Yeah.
also, is it, when you say not in Cochise County, so each county has a different set of rules?
So these are questions that I only know a little bit about, but my understanding is that the state of Arizona Department of Water Resources is the one who they put out these regulated areas. So you have like a Phoenix AMA, they call it, like an active management area. So there's conditions and regulations on how much water can be taken out. There's also a different kind of restriction, which is called an INA, an irrigation non-expansion area. And so that just means, hey, we can't put any more wells in the ground. We're already using more water than what we should be using. So neither one of those is in effect in Cochise County. And I'm not exactly sure the history, but what I've been told is that Cochise County kind of fought back against having some of those in the past because they didn't want the state telling them what they could and couldn't do. But now that people's wells are starting to dry up and they're having like, flooding issues where they didn't have flooding before. And I think water use is the main thing. Like people's wells drying up is a pretty clear signal that we're using too much water. So there are some people that would like to see some regulation start. And I'm not saying it's too late, but it's kind of like too late because so many more wells have been put in, and I don't really know what you can do about those. They're already in the ground.
Hi, this is Marianne. Just quickly.
Just real quick, Joe, if you want to stop the screen share, then
Sure.
and then we can all, there we go.
We do actually have an INA in Cochise.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in the Douglas Basin. It goes down to the border. It's not doing that well on decreasing groundwater withdrawal. So there's no expansion of the acreage, but the usage has been really intense. And there's some other issues regarding like how people are calculating their land and little specifics of collecting corners and amassing that to get new irrigation. But yeah, we do have an INA. It has not been that successful in curbing groundwater withdrawal. But anyway.
But some of these areas that like.
Not in Wilcox.
Yeah.
Not in that basin.
Or not over by Bowie, San Simone.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. I just thought I'd point that out.
Yeah, no, thank you.
So it looks like we have a comment.
I see a question. Are there fissures in the Sunazona area? Not right there. There's fissures down by Elfrida. And then there's fissures north, once you get past Birch, I think it's Birch, they got our fissures near the Dragoon and Cochise Stronghold, and then more over by the Sulphur Hills, but not in the Sunazona area. There's subsidence there, but we just don't have fissures yet.
Excuse me, Joe.
Yes.
Well, basically for the AMAs that kept, they were regulations put across enough. Basically, Cochise County just, said, nah, you just keep out of here. So that meant that, hell, it was pedal to the metal, and we're paying for it now. But and that still goes on. The thing is that what I really wanted to ask about, however, was have you looked at the new Landsat? I believe it is Landsat 9. But anyway, they're going to have, they've got sensors now, more sensors, I guess, with different bands of wavelengths. So some of these crap will actually show up because, and it's whether it shows up in a year like this, but you take a year like we've been having prior to this year, and ours wasn't a great monsoon, but it was pretty damn good here. I mean, Tucson, they were off the rails. But you will get the essentially like microfracturing over tops of some of these in real sandy soils in particular. And so you have a linear feature, but it just doesn't expand. Essentially, it all settles down with it.
Yeah.
And you'll see that along the edges of the Iowa Valley near the recharge one we put in there for Savsar.
Oh,
And anyway, now this was 10 years ago, and it was just because we were doing a lot of data collection for putting in the new recharge basins. And so, pretty much we found all kinds of this stuff, but it wasn't, it had not, they were more like desiccation cracks, I would say.
yeah. I haven't looked at that, but it sounds like a good tool for me to look at, because I kind of rely on good air photos to kind of just zoom in and look in these areas that I know there's subsidence happening. And sometimes Google Earth has really good high res photos, but they haven't updated the areas I need them to update in Cochise County. So
Well, I think you should definitely check into Landsat 9 then.
I just wrote it down. Thank you.
Because they just, I think you essentially have to apply, but there's no charge for the data now. And I believe that it covers the entire Earth every 16 days.
Oh, wow.
So you could get some really good time sequence stuff.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the tip.
Thanks, Steve. Karen has posted 2 links, ArizonaWaterDefenders.com and waterforarizona.com for more information on legislative issues. So if you guys are interested, you can click on those links and save them for later. Does anybody else have any questions or comments?
I just want to say the visuals were amazing. It's so, you see so much with your amazing documentation.
Yeah,
So,
well, I'll bet you
really-
ain't seen nothing yet.
There's been a,
But you
lot of,
approached it from many angles, and it was really great to
Okay,
see
thanks.
your mapping. Thank you.
I feel like there's been a lot of really good newspaper articles written on this. It's particularly Cochise County in the last couple of years. There's been a lot of attention given. And I know I get calls from different reporters that are in the Phoenix area or, Tucson area, but there's been even stuff in the, I don't know if it's the New York Times or not, but there's been some good articles written. And it's kind of gotten national attention. I mean, you always hear about California, but now we're starting to hear about the agriculture in Arizona and how problematic that can be.
Yeah.
It's just cheap land with no regulation, so it attracts a lot of people, and it's not even close to sustainable at this point. So I don't know. I don't want to. I feel like all I say is bad news in these talks, but I don't want it to be like that. But that's the topic today.
Just watch your cows.
Yeah.
It looks like we have another question from William.
Okay, I've seen it. Okay, are there fissures, subsidence areas, or GDC in the areas in around Sierra Vista and Hereford? No, there are not. We don't have a subsidence there, and I'm not sure why. It could just be because there's not as much groundwater use. There's not as much agriculture as there is in these areas. So that's really the ingredient that has to be there. Like you could have ranching and people living there, but those things don't use nearly as much water as agriculture does. I know people always mention this new dairy that went into Cochise County, and I don't know how much water they use compared to like the same area if it was crops. I mean, both of those can use a lot of water, but to my knowledge, we don't have anything going on near Sierra Vista and Hereford. You have the San Pedro there, even if it's not flowing, water does get recharged there. So that could be one reason why you don't have them. Oh, there's a link about the dairy right there.
Who's putting that on? I can't see it on my screen. There's no link.
If you go to the chat section, there's a bunch of links people put in there.
Open up chat, Steve, and it will.
I did. I just now clicked on it.
Okay.
Who posted it?
Looks like Karen.
Oh, okay. I see it now.
Yeah.
Right. That's on the legislative issues.
And if you scroll down, you can see the one from hcn.org. Does anybody
Yes, thank you.
have any questions or comments?
I see a question from Linda. Can Cochise County regulate the use of the vacant land to prohibit new farms going in? I don't know. I'm not sure what the county can do. I know they didn't want the state telling them what to do before, but I'm not sure. Maybe somebody else can answer that more than I can.
As far as I know, there's no regulation.
Yeah, I don't know of any. There was feedlot limitations, but they've expanded
Yeah.
greatly now to include a lot more animals. As of, I believe, 214. I had just a quick question regarding the cracks. Are those exacerbated by low rainfall? So that, or is it more the play of rain and dry?
Well, which cracks are we talking about? Any crack?
The desiccation cracks.
Desiccation cracks have to get wet and then dry out over and over and over again. That's what forms them. So any area that's kind of flat where water just soaks in, you could get desiccation cracks if the soil has the right components. But the fissures are generally eroded open by a lot of water. So if you get a good monsoon storm, that's when we tend to see the most activity.
Okay.
But yeah, water is an ingredient for both for different reasons. But yeah, if you didn't have any rain, I guess you wouldn't get as many cracks. So
just as wood swells and then contracts again with the season, and so it's actually the flux in the moisture, the humidity, that causes the expansion and the contraction.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is fascinating, and I also encourage everybody to look at WaterWise and the resources there. An incredibly helpful organization, and the way we change our water use personally. But I definitely feel this is one of those really large scale, it's a large scale problem that needs a large scale solution. I mean, state legislation sounds appropriate, but even maybe smaller local governments. I guess when I moved here, I thought that there were water usage laws, and it seems like that was an illusion, perhaps.
Yes.
I just wanted to say that this was a wonderful presentation, and there are petitions being circulated now to try to start an AMA in the Wilcox and Douglas area.
Thank you.
It's almost too late. It's at a point that the land has already been devastated in some areas.
It's a runaway train right now, so it would take some time to correct it, but maybe I still think it's worth trying, because otherwise it's just,
It is.
we know what's going to happen if you don't do anything. It's just going to keep getting worse.
If we stopped all pumping right now, as you de-water the more, let's say, clayer zones with delayed drainage, anyway, that's where you're going to get your actual movement, most of your compaction, because in a good sand, you've got grain to grain contacts with the water between. So they do not subside as much or compact as much. But it's that slow drainage from the real clay rich sediments that'll eat your lunch for 20, 30, 40 years after you stop pumping.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you put water back in, it doesn't necessarily reverse anything.
That's a good question. If it can be reversed, and once it's compacted, it's.
Yeah, there's at the point where you have too much compaction, you can't recover everything. You can bring the groundwater levels back up, but you're not gonna, the land surface is not gonna rebound to where it was. And you're never gonna hold as much water as you once did, because there's been that compaction. So that has happened in areas like Pinal County. The water levels have recovered quite a bit, but the subsidence that's been there it's still there, and you're not holding as much water as you did. So
I just wanted to put a little plug in for Waterwise again. Thanks, Allison, that we do have a YouTube channel, and it's UA Cooperative Extension Waterwise. You can search it that way, and we have past presentations, and Allison has kindly agreed to put this one up there when we get it recorded, downloaded, so you can tell your friends that if they missed it, they can find it there.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you for all the work that you do there as well. And we also have the Copper Queen Library YouTube channel, and so this will be uploaded. We'll share the link out. And I just really want to thank you, Joe, for being here and
Thank you.
for really elucidating this serious threat to our environment, but also for educating us. I think the more that we learn and know, the better equipped we are to move forward towards solutions and towards proactive action that can address some of these serious issues. It is terrifying being in a car and rerouted because there's a giant hole in the road, and to have to turn around and go back up to Benson and around, which happened to me. But rather than just see the whole, to really understand it and to be better prepared as a community and as citizens to address this. So I really appreciate your being here with us, and Marianne, you as well. So I would like
Thank you so much, Joe. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And so hopefully we will have more of these types of presentations and learn more together as a community. And thank you guys all so much for coming and for participating and being such wonderful library patrons. Have a great evening.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
You.